If your job at a healthcare facility includes disinfecting against viruses, you know prevention is the best medicine, and maintaining healthy spaces starts with a healthy cleaning routine. Grainger's world-class supply chain helps ensure you have the quality products you need when you need them, from disinfectants and cleaning supplies to personal protective equipment, so you can help deliver a clean bill of health. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hey there, I'm Gavin Fish. I have a YouTube channel that's called Gavin Fish True Crime. I know, not very creative. But what I lack in creativity, I more than make up for in the lengths I'll go to in order to expose the truth. I dig deep into real crimes affecting real families that have been botched, mishandled, or covered up by police, medical examiners, and politicians.
Emily called my parents and said, I don't know how to tell you this, but David started a fire. He started himself on fire.
There's many indications that this fire started before she exited.
I don't know the answer, but when you tell me a stun gun, it's because I didn't know that either, then obviously that raises flags.
My fiance's on the floor with blood everywhere. Oh my God, she stabbed herself.
Join me as I peel back layers of indifference, incompetence, and corruption each week. Just search Gavin Fish on YouTube or visit gavinfish.com.
Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and for this episode we have a special guest, Gerette Buglion, author of An Everyday Cult, co-founder of the hashtag #IGotOut online movement, a lifelong educator and writing consultant. Gerette's book will be featured as September's monthly memoir giveaway book of the month. For a chance to win a copy of this incredible resource, you can head over to Twitter and Instagram and find my account at CultVaultPod and interact with the posts for a chance to win your copy of An Everyday Cult. If you'd like to support the show, you can head over to patreon.com/thecultvault for access to weekly ad-free content and exclusive monthly deep dive episodes. Now it is my honour to present to you Gerette. So hello, Gerette, and welcome to the show. I am so glad that we're finally connecting after all of this time. And I'm really looking forward to our chat today, discussing your experiences and your memoir, An Everyday Cult. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Oh my gosh, I'm so delighted to be here with you today, Casey. After having heard quite a few of your interviews, I just so appreciate this podcast for my own self as well as for all the others of us living here in this kind of cult recovery space. So who am I? I'm Gerette Buglion, and I grew up in New York State in the United States. You know, in my childhood, I go into it a little bit in my book, kind of touch into the fact that I lived on a farm as a child, especially as an adolescent. And that, I think, is, you know, a bit of a core part of my identity is someone connected to animals as well as to nature and all of that stuff. After I was actually 33 years old when I started working with Doug, who I describe in my book. He's the leader of the group that I was a part of. I was involved in that group for 18 years. So it started out slowly and then kind of grew in its intensity. And then I got out. I got out at age 52. So I was in for 18 years. And now I have to say, and maybe we'll talk about this later too, but my work today is what really, makes my heart sing, which is working, with survivors of cultic or spiritual abuse. And it's such an honor and a privilege to do that. And I guess it's kind of a hard thing to say because I couldn't be doing that work unless I had gone through these 18 years of what I did go through. So here I am. Is that enough of an introduction?
Absolutely. Yeah. I imagine that those two things are quite difficult for you to juggle in your own mind when there's discussions around whether people should appreciate the good, not the good parts of a cult experience, but perhaps transferable skills, things that have shaped them into who they are today that they want to keep with them after they've discarded the stuff that is not healthy and not good to have with you all of the time. So it's kind of, I imagine, do you have these discussions a lot in your workshops?
Oh my gosh. And in fact, I did just earlier today. One of the ways that I think of that is that, no matter what our cultic experience is, I have witnessed in myself and in others that there's always what I call the golden threads. There are these threads, ways that we were nourished, ways that we were formed in a truly helpful way, or ways that maybe we were, like, if it's maybe even a relationship, a specific person or certain moments, even if the whole experience was polluted by power over abuse and controlling dynamics and all of those horrors, there's always the golden threads. And, for me, I'd say that that's part of it. For me, witnessing, having the lived experience now of having gone through this kind of abuse. And for me, fortunately, the abuse was not as overt. It was not life-threatening. It was not, I was not sexually abused, even though my sexuality was really messed with. I should have asked, is it okay to swear in this podcast?
Absolutely, yeah. I always tell people, and listeners will know what I'm about to say already, it's your story, so you can tell it however you want to. And the episodes, because of the material and themes, are always marked explicit anyway. So yes, Gerette, if you want to swear or curse or badmouth or anything, then you absolutely can.
Okay, that's great. It's good to know the parameters here. Just because what's funny, Casey, is that it's actually more in my post-cult life that I've learned just the feel-good power of swearing. I did not used to swear a lot. I mean, part of that probably has to do with the fact that I had young children and I didn't want to have a potty mouth around them. And I was never a prude. But I tell you, I kind of do like a good cuss word.
Yeah, but it helps to drive the point home, doesn't it?
It does. There's something that just, something that works in this space to swear about.
So you were not born into the group that you were a part of. And a lot of the conversations that we have on this show will be from second or third generation members or people that were quite young. So you've mentioned a little bit about life on the farm and a little bit of your young childhood, but what was life like for you leading up to when you were introduced to Doug?
Yeah, thanks for that. I was, a fully functioning sovereign adult. I had left my family, moved away from my family at age 19. I had moved out of the house at age 18. So I kind of did some of the house, meaning my father's home. My parents had divorced. When I was 16, my parents divorced. And there's actually a little bit about that too in my book. But then I moved farther north into the mountains. And that's where I think I kind of was finding my own self, my own identity. And I loved being, in the North Country, I'd call it. And it was there that I learned about Waldorf education. And I became a Waldorf teacher by, I think I was 24 or so. And I was a Waldorf teacher for 19 years. So that was like the school that I worked at was kind of a small rural school. And I did not experience any kind of, really overt abuse in any way in that school. But what I did experience was what I call a kind of priming of my mind for the Center for Transformational Learning, which is what I call the group that I landed in for 18 years. What I mean by a priming of my mind, Casey, is that in anthroposophy, which is the spiritual foundation of Waldorf education, there's a lot of right and wrong, and there's a very lofty spiritual doctrine that goes over it. It also is kind of far reaching in terms of giving advice for everything from, raising your children to very specific ways of raising your children. There's kind of the big picture, but then there's the micro of like, you have to make sure that your children don't get black crayons, and you have to make sure that your children always have hats on their heads. And so that kind of thinking was along the spectrum of controlling groups. And I know after I got out, I learned, a number of people who have experienced truly overt abuse in, anthroposophical or Waldorf settings. So that was a big kind of wake-up call for me to realize that. But that's really what led up to my experience. I was an active, Waldorf teacher when I started seeing Doug.
Right. And at this point, are you married to the partner that goes with you into this experience?
Yes. My husband and I met, right around, I was in my early 20s when we met. We were 23, 24. And so we were together actually for 6 years before we got married. And so he's, been with me this whole time. And we got involved in Waldorf education together, although he was not a teacher. He really participated. He got active. He was active on the kind of the school development work and got very interested. He's a farmer. He likes to garden and is a very avid farmer. So he got involved in what's called biodynamic farming, which is the branch of anthroposophy that relates to farming. And so he got very involved in that kind of training, as well as the spiritual training that goes with anthroposophy.
Okay, interesting that the theme of the gardens, and I know that this plays a concurrent thing throughout your book as well, around the farming and the gardening and the space, and the very kind of do-it-yourself couple that you were in terms of fixing things up and, making really, I want to say, like quirky households for yourselves to be in. I don't know if you have a better way of describing some of those environments.
Quirky is quirky. I'll take that. That's a good word. But I'd also maybe add to it that we were, a bit of idealists. We were seeking alternative community. We were we were very driven to create a society or a intentional community where we could live, not have to drive too much, have a school nearby, have a farming and good nourishing food, all of these ideals that are, beautiful things in and of themselves. But that was very much what we were exploring, what we were aiming for.
And how long into your partnership was it before you introduced your first child into the world?
Yeah, so we were together, so my first child was born in 95, and we were together. So we were already together for 14 years before my daughter was born. So we had quite a bit of time together already. We had a couple little times when we had separated sort of, during that time, just to kind of see, do we really want to do? Like, is this the relationship? And, I have to say, and obviously this is something that is expressed in my book, but probably not enough, is how integral my relationship with my husband is to my story. And yet, of course, he has his own story. And this one is really, mine. But we started, after our daughter was born, he started working with Doug about just like a month before I did. But I was very clear that I was not going to be ready to take on any new thing until after my child was at least 6 months old. That was like this rule I made for myself. And I followed through with that. So it was like right at 6 months, I had my first session with Doug, not having, of course, any idea of where it would lead me.
So your going through your own journey. You have your husband with you. My parents have been together for 30 years now and they're still not married. And my dad always says, I'm just not sure I found the one. And that's what sprang to mind when you said, we didn't have our first child until after 14 years of being together. And it's just another example of how there's no way to know the right amount of time to wait.
Something rather endearing about that. It keeps a kind of openness. For us, there was a point that it was really, important for us to make a commitment. And, our wedding took place on our property. It was a very humble wedding. I mean, there were over 100 people there, but it was, a potluck wedding. We offered, some main courses and the wedding cake, but, we had a band, a contra dance band, and it was all outdoors. We were married underneath the big maple tree out in the field that we still, walk to, multiple times a week. My dog ashes were buried out there. Like, it's a special spot. So for us, that was our way. But
I love it. Sounds beautiful. It sounds lovely. And at this point where your husband's been going to Doug already, then you decide to go for your first session. What is your understanding of who Doug is, what the sessions are, what you're signing yourself up to? How does that picture look at that moment in time?
I love that question. Then what I thought I was signing up for was to learn more about myself in a really reflective and honest way, and to use the archetypes, the archetypes that come in our dreams that we have every night, as a kind of a guide for that. I didn't really know what the archetypes were, but what I did know was that two of my colleagues and good friends who I worked with at the school had already been seeing Doug for a while. And what I saw in them was a kind of radiance, I saw them shift. And what I perceived was that I saw them like become more interested in life in a truly honest way. And there was also a dynamic that they shared with each other that I was a little bit jealous of, and I kind of wanted in on that action. Like, oh, they can talk with each other in a way that I don't know what they're talking about. So I felt a little bit excluded, I think, by the way that they would engage. And I don't remember the language or anything of it. It was just that I could see that there was a way that they communicated that I didn't know how to. And that followed, there was another good friend of mine who had a baby just a few months later. So, we were pregnant together. And that was also part of, she had been involved, in what I call the work for a long time as well. And so I also kind of wanted something that they had that was a kind of depth. And it's ironic, Casey, because being involved in anthroposophy and Waldorf education, you're dealing with kind of deep spiritual stuff anyway. But I think there was something about the anthroposophy that felt maybe a little too stuffy, or a little like old fashioned or something, and a little too, I think I'll say dogmatic. And so there was what I was perceiving in other people is that they had a kind of lightness to them, that it's like, okay, I want more of that. That's all I was looking for.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about just seeing something in other people and thinking maybe that's something I would like for myself. This podcast was born in lockdown when my firstborn was 4 months old. There's a huge identity crisis that you go through when you become a new parent. And this is not something that everybody tells me about the sleep deprivation. Everybody tells me about labor might be the most dreadful experience of your life, and it fills you with all the horror stories. But nobody really tells you about the identity crisis that you have. All of a sudden, not the person that you were. You don't have the freedom that you did. And it's really difficult to work through that. And I feel like when my son was 4 months old, I got to this stage where I was like, I need something that is separate from motherhood. And it took me a while to realize that, first of all, that's okay. And second of all, how many other women or parents go through this and just don't recognize it or don't speak about it? And I wonder if maybe you were feeling some of this maybe when you decided to go and see Doug.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. For me, I would say it was a little bit more premeditated because I had decided, even when I was pregnant, okay, I want to do that, but I'm going to wait. However, maybe maybe there's a way that I did. I should give myself a little bit of credit, that I knew myself well enough to give some space, to not dive into it right away. And I think that was a good choice. However, as new moms, there is a vulnerability. There's no question. And what we know in the cult recovery, the cult education world today is that many, many people enter a controlling religion or cultic environment at vulnerable points in their lives. And here, that was my vulnerability. Like, yes, it's like I am bound. I love this child, but I'm bound to her. And yes, I wanted a space. I wanted a little place that I could really call my own. And I think that is, I've never thought about this, Casey. It's a really great question, because here I was seeking an identity, like separate from my mother, being, mother of my child. But what I was actually moving towards was a loss of identity, a loss of autonomy. And so it's interesting that impulse is valid and good and healthy and vibrant. Just, let's pay attention to where we do end up. And at first it wasn't that. It wasn't so controlling.
Okay, so who is Doug? Where do these sessions take place? What does your first session look like? All of that stuff. Paint this whole picture for us and I'll just let you run with everything.
Yeah, so who is Doug? Well, that's a question I did not ask before meeting him. So what I can say, what I know now, is that he's someone who was a civil servant. He just did, merchant type work. And he is like self-taught in terms of his work as a Jungian analyst. And he has absolutely no training. He has no certification. And he also is, at the time, what we called an uncertified, non-licensed therapist. Like he actually had all of us when we were in the training program. We'll get into this later, but in case I forget to mention it, he actually had all of us make sure that we registered with the state to be an unlicensed, there's no accountability. There's no board that you are accountable to. There's no educational standards he was accountable to. And the same is true for the people that he trained to do the work that he did. But that part did come a little bit later. So when I first went to Doug, it was to his house. He had an office in his house that was this big old farmhouse, that you just probably early 1900s, maybe even the late 1800s farmhouse. Rather stately. I had no idea what to expect. I just knew that I had, made an appointment to see him. So I would go there for sessions. In my very first session, there were, which I describe in quite detail in my early in my book, I experienced the kind of dependence that he cultivates really from that very first session. And that was centered around a couple things, but one was the fact that I had this feeling that I had been sexually abused as a child. And it was something that wasn't really going away. And I had decided before I went to see him that was what I wanted help with. And I thought, okay, maybe, based on what my friends have said, maybe he's the one to help me with it. So I went in with I forced myself to get the words out of my mouth that's what I was hoping for. And he actually, the way that he handled that was by the end of the session, ultimately saying, let's not worry about that right now. If it's a real issue, it'll come back. And for me, after having gone through a whole hour of being with him, being immersed in this world, learning about what the way that he would look at dreams and the animus who's going to guide me to know myself better, and how I had come to certain assumptions in the dream that I brought to him, it just made perfect sense. And there was a kind of relief when he said, let's not worry about it. It gave me, it actually was helpful for me. In all honesty, it was probably I don't know if I would say an ethical thing to do, but it was a helpful thing for me at that time. So that's part of what gave me the desire and the impulse and the confidence to keep coming back.
It reminds me of when people say, oh, my first session of auditing with Scientology was really helpful. It makes certain things a lot easier.
Yes.
Of course, when the levels change, it doesn't feel like that anymore. But almost like when people say, you know, you're chasing that first high after trying particular narcotics, and the addiction grows and the dependency grows. And dependency is an interesting word that you used, because I know you do a lot of work with Esther Friedman, and her book, A Gentle Soul's Revolution, has such an amazing part in it about dependency. And I'd never really thought about it in that much depth until reading her work. And I was just blown away. I felt crippled reading her writing about how she couldn't do anything without feeling like she needed to ask leadership. It's scary to think that dependency, Doug was working on that from your initial meeting.
Yeah. And then there's always this question, you know, about cultic leaders, like, is it intentional? Or is it like, was he intentionally planting seeds of dependence? Or was he sincerely offering this wisdom, this, you know, approach to looking at dreams that he was super passionate about? I honestly think it's probably, in this situation, I think it's probably the latter, that he grew. My sense with Doug is that, and I'll never know this because this is Doug's story, but I think his control, you know, grew over time, like that. It was kind of, you use the word high. I think he got high on realizing, wow, I can say these things and this kind of framework, and people really seem to like it. You know, there's a high, there's something like when you're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with unconscious material, you know, and people like open up, or their feelings start gushing, or they have these aha moments. You feel like it feels really good, and you keep doing that enough, you know, and I think, you know, Doug probably always had some narcissistic components to him, but I think they grew as his ego grew.
And his following as well.
Well, and that's exactly what I was just thinking, Casey, as those words came out of my mouth. It's like there's an intertwined relationship between, and here I am linking my fingers together like this, you know, that the followers need a leader and the leader needs followers. And it's like this unspoken contract. You know, in some cultic environments, it actually is a literal contract. I spoke with a couple of people actually today about literal contracts that were written really to keep them held hostage. But I also think that the unspoken contracts can be just as powerful.
Especially when you are going to Doug with the assumption that he is accredited in some way with this information of this experience that you think you might have had, which is deeply rooted in your subconscious and possibly very triggering and traumatic to tell him and to think about, and to try and work out whether, you know, you're correct in thinking that this might have happened to you in terms of sexual abuse. I don't know if you would have, do you feel like you would have trusted him with that information if you knew that he was unlicensed and uncertified?
That's a really good question. I may have, actually. And if I knew that he had no training and was unlicensed, it may have been just a seed of doubt that had grown sooner, and it could have grown. And we talk about cognitive dissonance a lot in the cult recovery world. And, when things started not matching up in a way, maybe the fact that he was not licensed and had no one to be accountable to, if I had known that earlier, perhaps it would have been a crack. But at that time, I don't think I cared. I was more impacted by what my friends were experiencing.
And your initial session with Doug, you felt was quite positive. His tactic around saying, let's not think about the sexual abuse for now, we'll come back to it later if we need to, you felt was beneficial in the moment for you. So it's all kind of feeling good right now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it was good. Like my first 5 years were, pretty. I think of it, in my book, I actually talk about it as, 5 different stages of cultic involvement. The first stage being about falling. And I think of that falling as being both falling in love and falling asleep. That there's this, kind of, everything is good. And for me at that time, I'm a new mom. I started my work back up in the school where I taught, just part-time. I was home a lot. I wasn't obsessed by the work. It was helpful to me. I loved to talk with my friends, my dear friends and colleagues. Like there were 3 or 4 people who I really appreciated connecting with. And those relationships, I think, were deepened by also having, like the work that we could talk about. So it was pretty darn good. I think that like that second stage of involvement for me was what I call drifting. And that was like a place of getting a little bit more untethered. At that point, my husband and I moved away from where we were living, where our home was. We owned a home, we loved our home, but we still had this like, oh, what about intentional community? Let's try it out. Let's go to a place where we can live it for a while. And so we moved to an anthroposophically oriented community and lived there for 2 years. And during that time, there was, I just keep going back to the word, I was being untethered. Like the links that I had that held me to my home, which is a place where I did feel really anchored and grounded, having those cut were really hard on me. And my friends, I thought, I was moving back closer to my family. I thought that would be great. And it was great in many ways. But there was also living in community, a spiritually oriented community. We were working and living with people with special needs. And that was intense. Like it's an intense lifestyle. So there's very little time, even though my mom lived, a half an hour away or 20 minutes away, and 4 of my sisters lived nearby. We didn't see a whole lot of each other. Like it wasn't like suddenly they were in my life so much more. So when I started to realize that I was not happy in that situation, and that's where my husband and I had a bit of a crisis while we were in that community. But during that time, and I think that was also part of that untethering. And so where my psyche went was more and more and more to the work. So even like I had less anchor in my own life because I was doing this thing, like I was seeking, how Janja Lalich often talks about how cult people are drawn into cults because you're idealists. We were the classic idealists. And when those ideals started not quite, manifesting, I felt severed, untethered.
To physically exhibit how that feels internally must be erratic and stressful. It kind of makes me feel a little bit like
like, I hear that, and yet it's so interesting, Casey, what the mind does. In my situation, although that's what I was feeling in my body, my mind was compensating and believing that I needed more. I needed to do the work more seriously so that, because that feeling that I was having was actually a manifestation of what we called pathology in CTL, the Center for Transformational Learning. So that whole narrative was, becoming more and more like my anchor. So I started putting more faith in that.
Well, that's so tough, isn't it? When certain things are changing and in flux and the work stays the same and the people involved in the work stay the same and your access to the work stays the same. I mean, here comes that dependency that we were just talking about. The answer to all of those things is to throw yourself into the work more, like a slippery slope. I don't know how you would word that.
That's a good way. Slippery slope works because that slippery slope went only in one direction at that point. Because by the time we realized, we went through kind of a marriage crisis while we were in that community and came to a place that we knew we really wanted to stay together. We kind of weathered that. And staying together meant moving back north and leaving the community. It was not the place. When we left for the community, we thought, oh, maybe this is where we're going to live the rest of our lives. Like, we didn't know, but very fortunately, and I want your listeners to take heed of this, we had a very good friend who said, don't sell your home. Give yourself some time, just rent it out. And then if you decide it's really what you want to do, then you can do that later. And I am so grateful for that advice. Because had we sold our home and not been smart with our money, we were not smart with our money in general, we wouldn't have had our home to go back to. In this situation, like I said, there are these golden threads. Like, yes, me going back to my home was really important. So after 2 years in the community, we moved back north, and my husband has a good job. It took us a while to get kind of reoriented. But at that point, I believed fully that what I was most moving back north for was the work and the growing community. Because while we were gone for 2 years, things really started cooking in the community. And what I mean by community now is I'm talking about the one up north around the Center for Transformational Learning. It actually was starting to become a school. Classes were being taught. There was one class that had been taught for years, that Doug had taught for years, but now it was becoming bigger. Now a retreat center was being built, and there was just so much to be going back to. And I fully believed that that's what I was going back to, that was more important.
So it's almost like the promise of intentional community with the chance to live in your home where you feel safe.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. Great observation, Casey. But yes, and I think that's part of why it was so appealing. And our home was like north of where a lot of the other people lived. So we were closer to the center where the retreat was built. So there were lots of reasons. And then at that point, that's when I shifted to the stage of what I call, in my process, asleep. That's the third stage of my cultic involvement. Because at that point, I was so bought in. I had invested so much, dedicated so much of my time, my energy, my belief systems, my money. I mean, I've been all these years paying, for sessions. I just really desperately needed the work to work. And so I kind of went all in. Through Doug's advice, I actually started a cleaning company. And then after just a little over a year with the cleaning company where I was actually making good money, he then advised me to buy a bigger cleaning company. And so there was this kind of like, oh yes, this is the way God works. This is the way the animus guides us to live our lives to the greatest, fullest potential. This is it. This is the beauty of it here. And so, I really believed it, and went fully in. And it was pretty intense. It was really, we ultimately ended up going bankrupt. But that was after years of just like working to the bone. I literally worked not only, 50, 60, 70-hour work weeks for the cleaning company, because the cleaning company kind of became this place of where I was trying to prove that Doug was right. That I was trying to prove that this was where I could finally manifest in the world and show that, what it looks like when someone who is connected to the divine, to divine inspiration and to finances, that this is what it looks like. And what it looks like is pretty fucked up.
Well, you explained there, the sunk cost fallacy almost meant that he had to be right.
Yes.
So in these first one-to-one sessions that you're having with Doug, how many times a week and how long do the sessions take place for? How much do they cost in comparison to your kind of hiatus and return to Doug, where the group sessions start taking place? What are the differences between your kind of first impressions and your reintegration?
Yeah, great question. So we mostly did sessions every other week. And the session started at $55 a session. By the time that I left, we were paying $120 for a half-hour session. So there was this, in 18 years, that's, quite an inflation. I haven't done the math on that, but pretty significant. The more he thought, the better he thought he was, the more he would charge. And obviously he thought highly of himself. I think it's important to say too, that I never left the work, even though I moved away. I was still not only was it every other week a session, we also had a monthly couple session. So my husband and I would meet with him. And that was a big part of our work. And we made sure that when we moved away, that the community that we were working in would cover those expenses, because we were not paid for our time. We were just given a small stipend, but a condition of our living there was that they would cover Doug's expenses. And they did. They definitely honored that. It's kind of almost too bad. I would recommend, that's like another place where I would recommend more scrutiny, because why would that be something, so important? What is that? And, what is it that this amount of money that the community funds is going to what? For what? Why? How? Anyway, that's another thing. But when I returned, so at this point, I'm now, let's see, like about 13 years in. When we moved back, I'd been active in the work for 13 years. The intensity really picked up. And there were not only these classes, so I would go to classes at least twice a week. And the classes were, you paid anywhere from $500 to $1,000 for a course. And that could be, maybe a 6-week course or something like that. So there were the courses, there were the sessions that were also weekly, every other week, couple sessions. I also did sessions for my business manager of the cleaning company. So, there were times that I would see Doug, 2-3 times a week. And then I'd go through periods where I'd feel like I was really slipping in my inner work. So I actually did, at 2 different points, I actually did daily sessions with him, thinking that's going to be what's going to finally help me break my stubborn pathology that's getting in the way of, because you always have to have something negative that you're fighting against. For me, it was, my pathology. I was too prideful and too, very stubborn. And
according to Doug,
I had a massive pride problem. And speaking was not okay. I couldn't be trusted in how I spoke. Whatever I said was not trustworthy. But the other really big expense were the retreats. So it's amazing. We've been speaking this long and I haven't even said the word retreat, Casey. How is that possible? But the retreats were a major part of the CTL, Center for Transformational Learning experience. And so that's where we would go. At first, they were just weekends, and then they grew to becoming longer and longer up until over a week, 8 days. And they were quite pricey. They were, anywhere, they ranged from, $300 to $500 to over I think $1,200 or something at the end for just a session. But it wasn't just one retreat a year. You had to do at different levels of the CTL hierarchy. You had to commit to more and more retreats. And some of those retreats were away retreats. So sometimes you would travel, 5 or 6 hours by car, or, the farthest one was traveling, to Europe for a retreat in Europe, and massive expenses there. And here we were, like, literally after I had filed bankruptcy and we had fortunately saved our home. I was so, like I said, this stage of being asleep, I was so asleep that even after the bankruptcy was when I actually invested in this retreat going out to Europe. It's like there was no end. It's like this bottomless pit that there was always, always more.
I think what's important to mention to the listeners here, who I hope will go and pick up a copy of An Everyday Cult, is that you helped to build this community. You were part of ideas around the retreats and ideas around the sessions and the buildings, and you had the cleaning company. So you would clean these massive, huge chandeliers in the building, and you would be trusted by Doug with these extra responsibilities. You weren't just somebody who was attending the sessions, you were integral to the growing of this community. So when all of these things were happening and you felt like you couldn't be there, I got the sense that there was this kind of fear that you couldn't let go of almost.
Absolutely. And yes, FOMO, this fear of missing out, is huge. It's a huge controlling factor in all cultic environments, for sure. You create this, it's like this, I love that you use the word urgency, because that's another controlling technique. That this sense of like, this is going to be the time. Just dig a little deeper into your soul. And when we added the whole layer of past lives, that kind of added a whole new dimension to the work. Like there was always something, there's always like another door. It's like stepping into Narnia, but having, 20 doors in the wardrobe, each one being more and more enticing, that there was always some place, something more to strive for. And you couldn't say no, because then you would like miss the boat. And they would literally use some of that terminology, like, okay, this train's pulling out of the station, get on, like this next retreat's going to be such an important retreat. Like they would, literally use that language to compel us. And even if they didn't use that language, I still would have felt it.
Well, you had all of your peers around you as well that you were doing this work with, saying, oh my goodness, I'm so excited to go on this next retreat. That in itself is, even if you have a group of friends saying, I'm going to this music festival, or we're all going out for dinner later this week, you're like, how can I be there? How can I get there?
Yeah, exactly.
There was a few notable parts in the book for me that I wanted to touch upon. One of them was going back to your first workshop. When you were in the waiting room before you went into your first meeting with Doug, you had an old school friend who left Doug's office before you entered. And I felt like that was a very significant part of the book because of the events that unfold later on.
Yeah. John Jay, I call him in my book. He had been a beloved friend, a friend that my husband and I had known for, I can't tell you really how long, but yes, definitely a number of years before starting to do the work with Doug. I didn't even know, as I mentioned, there were a few people I knew who were doing the work, but I didn't even know that he was doing it. So when he kind of stumbled out of Doug's office that very first session, we had like fleeting eye contact. But the truth is, Casey, he was in such a state. If I had been more present with myself and maybe not so nervous about my first meeting with Doug, I maybe would have reflected more like, wow, he didn't recognize me, in that moment. I also found it a great comfort to know that he was also doing the work. And there are aspects of the work, that he was very involved in. He's someone who actually worked for Doug a lot, which red flag, big warning sign to everybody. If you are seeking therapeutic support from somebody and they ask you to work for you, please say no. I also did quite a bit of work for Doug. As you alluded to earlier, Casey, but I even, continued into things like doing bookkeeping and stuff for him. But John actually worked a lot doing, kind of handyman kind of work. Ultimately, John was someone who was beloved in the community, a very endearing kind of man, but continually was often noted throughout the years in the work as someone who would often fall short of the goals of the work. So he might take a step forward in his inner work, but then he would fall back down. And Doug was pretty merciless in pointing that out in a similar way that he was pretty merciless pointing out my failings in the work. So there was a way that both John and I really believe in many cultic groups, particularly in this, what I would call the everyday cult type of group that's less formed, kind of more amorphous in a way that, that there's, I think, a way that, oh, geez, Bruce, I just lost my train of thought because I had an itch on my eye. So I was talking about John. I think part of it is losing my train of thought is that it's just incredibly painful to think about him still today, because, like I was saying, both he and I were kind of ridiculed and our failings were pointed out more than some other people. And there were, in a controlling group, I think that the leader will often know who it's okay to do that to. And clearly, John and I were. There were a number of others as well. But some people were actually quickly raised through the ranks, way faster, even though I'd been in at this point, 13, now 15, 16 years. And what ultimately happened was that John committed suicide. And there's a lot of conjecture about what all went into his death. And it was just, and continues to be such a tender wound. It's funny, I've spoken about him before when I haven't cried, but I'm, feeling the loss. And I guess it's also like, it's in addition to the loss of him, it's also like the work that I do now, I see the loss. I see how many losses there are. How, in terms of, sometimes it's our children who are lost to us through our cultic involvement. Sometimes it's our parents. Sometimes it's our siblings. Sometimes it's our, husbands and wives and partners. And, sometimes it's our beloved friends like John. And of course, I'll never know, after he died and years after he died, I learned more about his background and learned, that there's complexity there. There was suicide in his family that I didn't know about. But what I am certain of is that the way that he was treated in that environment was dehumanizing and profoundly disrespectful to the incredibly gorgeous human being that he was.
And that's definitely reflected in your work as well, how you write about John and his impact on you and your husband and the community, and the impact that his death had on your community at the time you learned of his completion of suicide. And I'm so sorry that you experienced that. And I'm sorry for all of the things that John was going through, and that none of you had an inkling that this was going to happen, and the amount that it still impacts you today. It's a difficult thing that has so many different elements attached to it. When you put CTL next to John's name and wonder, if things would have been different if he never met Doug. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. Thank you, Gerette. And something else that I wrote down on my question list, maybe you can help me make more sense of this, because I was making notes as I was reading your book, but I've written, "Don't jump in with crazy." I don't know if that's a quote from your work. It doesn't sound like something I would write down. Don't jump in with crazy. And then I've written Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, Laurie Vallow and Chad Daybell. These couples are problematic and claimed to have met in a previous life and were destined to meet again. So I think that must be in relevance to Doug and his partner.
Right. And that theme that happens very often with these controlling leaders, that there is some kind of mystical, grandiose way that they have, the two have come together. I mean, of course, there are plenty of cult leaders where it's just a single person, but when it is two, and there's that added element of mystical relationship, that adds, of course, to the mystique. Don't jump into crazy. I honestly don't know what that is, Casey, but my sense is that perhaps there's a compelling element in these, cultic narratives that is that can be kind of wild, like it can be really good to just, go all the way in to something wild and crazy. And that if you're not doing that, that's your problem. You're actually cutting yourself off from the freedom, the spiritual freedom that's just around the next bend, the next retreat, and the next $1,000 and whatever it might be.
I think that it might have actually even been in reference to, if one person presents in a certain way with severely narcissistic traits or even psychopathic traits, and then pairs with another person that has those traits, I think that must be what I meant by those two things. And it was fascinating in the book when the couple come forward with this story about how they've met in a previous life, and all of you just go, yes, that makes so much sense.
Most likely in a group where you're spending a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of volunteer, and a lot of your life force and your thoughts and energy are getting involved, if a narrative like this comes up, it's probably bullshit. just saying, or just to use caution around it, just let it. Yeah, that's the cult educator in me, that I can't go past certain things without just calling out. It's not like, what is that, that makes, it's just compelling, it's juicy, it's also confirmation bias. Like, we want our leaders to have, to be leaders that deserve the pedestal that we want them to be otherworldly. We want, because we want us to be on the path that's most important, or most, unique and special. So it's kind of like they're confirming, their story was just confirming, oh, that's an inkling I had already. Like, yes, it's like, ay. Sometimes when I think about that wedding, their wedding was such a trip. It was unbelievable. There was actually like a whole theatrics around it. Like, we all got kind of involved and, wore even costumes in a way. And, one of the sad parts that I reflect back on now is that the Doug's partner, the bride's father, did not walk her down the aisle, did not have a role in any way. And I remember at one point I was sitting quite close to him, and that was for me like a little crack. I saw the pain in his face. And it was after we had done this theatrical thing. And I think it must have been, when I was walking back to my seat, and he was like, why is the father sitting there? Was my question. Like, did he not have a place? So later, in my, in the work of, cult recovery, I think about these moments of cracks, like, where were those places where actually cognitive dissonance, entered, and it actually was slightly felt. Normally in my normal state, I would be glossing over something like that. But I don't think I'll ever forget his face, the pain, just sadness.
Wow, that's really interesting. I wonder how many other people have got those kind of stamps of moments where they've, I don't know, the shelf cracking, I don't know.
Many people do. In fact, that's part of what comes up in the writing workshops. Just a moment when there was some awareness that something is not right. When we explore those moments, boy, they do open up things.
We haven't really explained for the listeners. You had your one-to-one sessions with Doug initially, and you continue to have some one-on-one communication with Doug, but the group sessions were really when I felt things changed. That's how it felt for me reading the work. How would you describe the group sessions, how they changed, and what that meant for you as an individual participating?
Yeah, the group sessions were primarily taking place in the retreats. So that's like when we're like away from home, days on end, where we're with a small group, and there are, facilitators, leaders that are the leaders of each small group. And then we sometimes would go back into the large group. Like every day there'd be large group sessions and small group sessions. But what was very interesting about them is that no matter whether you were in the large group with everybody or you were in your small group, Doug actually is the one that would he would make rounds to all of the different small group sessions, and they took place in different buildings and lean-tos all over the property. So he would literally drive around on his a four-wheeler to get from one place to another. So we would know he's coming by the sound of the four-wheeler. And sometimes we'd hear it coming towards us, and the heart would start pumping, beating, whoa, 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 he's coming. And then he'd peel off and go to some other place, and you'd be like, oh. But he would be coming to work each person's dreams and tell the leaders what the dreams meant. So none of the leaders, even though they've been working for years with him, many of them, they were, until the very, very end, they were not paid for their leadership, and B, they were also not given freedom to explore their own instincts about what a particular dream or a particular situation with one of the dreamers might be. And, ironically or interestingly, when there was this whole big crisis that took place later, at the end, when I left at the end, it happened because a number of these leaders were actually at a retreat without Doug. So for the first time, they had the experience of not having his shadow over them. And that's when they themselves also there was some trouble beforehand, but I didn't know anything about it, even though I was in the executive committee, doing ridiculous amounts of volunteer for what I thought was the decision-making body of the organization. But there was something about the leaders, and like I said, I was never a leader, even though I was in for 18 years. There were some leaders who were there for just, became a leader in just a few years. By taking off the pressure of Doug being there, they could suddenly actually be themselves more and see the control and the oppression that they themselves had been under.
The workshops are building in intensity. And you've mentioned a couple of things that happen that are contributing to your kind of coming out of a coma almost. What is it that is the tipping point? Are there any more instances or stamps or snapshots where you have these experiences, or is it just a gradual thing until you leave?
For me, Casey, my leaving, in my experience of being in it, was I had no doubts. I was 150% in until that the last executive committee meeting, and everybody's leaving, or the leaders are leaving. But in retrospect, I can look back and see that there are these points, like these places where there were cracks. Like I just talked about with the father at the wedding, the father's sad face. Like there was going to a far and away retreat where I was supposedly, like I was the official person. So I was kind of being elevated to be the official person. And I was told how wonderful it would be. I was told that, Doug would take me out to lunch because it was a 2-day workshop, and that there'd be I would have this special place, and, I would be able to put out the books and the things we had for sale, and what an honor it was. Like I was carefully coached for how to play that role. And once I got there, there was even the question that maybe I would travel with them, but that didn't even happen. Like the person who was coaching me said, you should touch base with them if maybe you travel together or not. And, Doug very quickly let me know that, no, that was not going to happen. And it's like, okay, that's cool. I'm fine driving, But then when I was there was a couple of moments, Doug did not take me out to lunch. I was just belittled, actually, even while I was there being the representative of CTL. It was awful. So that was very confusing to me. But I would kind of always try to keep a chipper, upbeat kind of, I mean, I'm a positive person just in general by nature. And that was the case then as well. And then there was a particular one of the dramatization of the dreams that took place where, there's an invitation for people to go into like an authentic expression of the different parts of the dream that each dream is being played out. Sorry, we haven't really described this yet, but that was a core component of the work that we did, which was this vessel. It was like we would have this container where one person's dreams would be acted out.
Yeah.
In that acting out experience, it was very deep. It was very filled with emotion and often a kind of a spiritual feeling that was, in many ways very rich. I think a little bit, maybe a little like the hit of a drug that we talked about at the beginning of our conversation. But I was in one of those at this away retreat where I was not taken out to lunch. And I felt a very strong connection to this person's dream. And when you feel that, we're trained, when you feel that, to trust it. And because that's like supposedly the animus or the anima or the spiritual, archetype, divine person speaking through you, and let yourself be expressed. And there's some real validity to that, even though there's also a lot of other, bullshit control. It's both. But in this particular moment, I felt very strongly about this person's dream, and I started speaking. And I will never forget the way that Doug looked at me. And it was this with contempt. It was like his darts coming out of his eyes. And it was this like, who do you think you are, Gerette? Like, he just was like, needed to put me in my place. And I knew, like, there is a part of me that knows to this day that I experienced something authentic about this person's dreams, dream that was cut off because of his contempt, his need to control me in that moment. And what a disservice that was to the person whose dreams we were, exploring at that time. So that was one of those moments where there was a crack, haunted me.
In the same way that you were cut off from that person's dream, you saw an authentic part of Doug, I feel, in that moment as well. So even though you missed out on one piece of authenticity, you did get another.
I got another, not the way I was expecting it, but yes. And I think that was part of, like I said, a crack. Even though talking to me, during that time, I remember going out to dinner with a group of people that night. And because I was not in any special relationship or elevated space, in Doug's eyes. So a whole group of us went out, which was really fun. But I remember being really actually kind of disassociated at that point. And that's why, that there was this cognitive dissonance between what I had been coached for, at that point, 18 years to do, to be authentic in someone else's dreams, and to have Doug so really violently, to me it was violent. And I don't know, like, it would be very interesting to speak to other people who were there. I can think of one person I know who was there, and just see if anyone else noticed it. I don't, but it was a very powerful moment for me.
And even though Doug was violent in his interaction with you in that moment, he was actually physically violent with you as well. Or am I confusing Doug with somebody else? Who was it that strangled you?
Well, the strangling was a different kind of violence. And that was definitely, Doug set it up. And what's really interesting about this is that here we were focused on the spiritual integrity of each dream. Like this is what CTL was all about. And yet at this particular retreat, when Doug came up and heard my dreams, kind of gave his 2 cents, he came up with this intervention, which was, and I don't even know what the other dreams were, the dreams that I actually had were, because it's like everything else was erased because of his intervention. But in his mind, my dreams were about showing me how I could not be trusted, how anything that came out of my mouth was a lie or was manipulative, and trying to get somebody, to like me for the wrong reasons, or to get attention in some way, and that I needed a harsh intervention. So he asked one of the other participants, who happened to be a big, burly, football player type person, to literally, put his hands around my neck, but to not use pressure. So whenever I spoke, these enormous hands would come around my throat. And it was just extraordinarily confusing, humiliating. And like, even at that point, that happened probably at about, in that time that I call, I don't know, somewhere between drifting and asleep is when it happened. No, it was probably in a sleep, actually. It was definitely in a sleep. That was actually one of the events, and at the beginning of falling asleep, because at that point, again, I had invested so much. I needed the work to work, like that sunken cost fallacy, like this man who knows me better than anybody else. If he believes this, then this has got to be true. And so not only did I have to endure that through that retreat, so there were a number of times that happened, not only in our quiet, small group session up on the, separate from other people, but it also happened a few times in the big, what we call the big group. But, something that I don't think I wrote this in my book, but I know that experience for that person, the man who was given that task, was extraordinarily uncomfortable for him. And he did not want to do that. Like, I felt that, like, I have that awareness, like, even when it was happening, I could feel his discomfort. And he never came back to another retreat. And I honestly, Casey, I have actually tried to find him because, in writing my book, I did reach out to to everyone who would recognize themselves in a scene, even though I did a lot of changing names and mixing things up to protect people's identities. I unfortunately was never able to find him. And that's actually been really hard for me. I don't know where he is. And if I could speak to him, I would absolutely, let him know that I know that he meant absolutely no harm. And I'm sorry that he had that experience. I'm really sorry that he had that experience, and had, kind of had that on him, because in the, like, that intervention became something that I had to repeat every single retreat for years, for the next 5 years. I had to share that experience as an example of the way my pathology worked and how much I could not be trusted.
It's absolutely despicable that Doug would use his position of power to gather information from people's most vulnerable sources. And he is not only encouraging, but demanding that this practice takes place and telling you that you are a certain type of person, which just the list that you gave us of your supposed personality traits sounds like pure projection. I imagine that Doug, the way that I perceive him in my own mind, really enjoyed it, which is another difficult and uncomfortable thing to comprehend. And at the start of our conversation, you said that your experience is not as severe as other people in terms of the type of abuse or level of abuse that you experienced. But I feel that when people speak that way about themselves, they're diminishing their own experiences, because we are taught to believe that if you hear something that sounds worse than your situation, then you're not allowed to feel your own abuse to a certain level or a certain degree.
Yeah, although just to be really clear, Casey, for my experience is that I have allowed myself to feel and heal from the depths, and continue to heal from, the depths of that experience. In no way do I diminish my experience or someone else's experience, because the psychological impact is severe. And I really, I know that in the core of my being, that to me, that is not a place of negotiation or even belittling an experience.
That's really helpful for me to hear you say that, because I worry that when people speak to me and they say, oh, I had a really hard time, but it wasn't as bad as some of the other people that you've spoken to, that really worries me, that people feel that their experiences aren't as important to discuss. If I'm articulating myself okay.
Yes, you absolutely are. And I agree with you that does happen, and in the work, that I have the privilege and the honor to do now with people in cult recovery, I have witnessed again and again that holding space for the depth of the harm that people have experienced is vitally important. I'm not a therapist, but I approach it from the perspective of, really honoring the lived experience, however it manifested, whether it was sexual abuse, whether it was physical violence, whether it was, extreme, coercive manipulation, and however it manifested it's unique to each person.
Thank you, Gerette. I really appreciate that. Sometimes I have these moments during these conversations where I kind of have my own epiphany, where I'm like, wow, I think about that differently, and then go away and have conversations inside myself on how that might change now, how I think about things and how I see things. And every interview is like a continuation of my education. One of the best parts of reading your work for me was your snapping moment. So I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through how that happened.
For sure. It's the best moment for me too. So what happened is there was a massive crisis in the organization, in CTL. And I had mentioned earlier about the leadership having a retreat where Doug wasn't there. And what happened shortly after that experience, that retreat, all 6 of the head leaders left on the same day. And the way that we communicated, as the whole organization communicated, was all through email. So there was just this massive, exchange. And I got this, I saw the first one come in, and in CTL, we had this kind of open door policy, it was okay for people to come and go. If you needed to step back from the intensity of the CTL fold, it's okay. And the good people, if you're really in it, in the right spirit, you're going to be back. Just take a break for a little while, come back. And if you don't come back, well, you've lost it anyway, and you never were going to get it. We'd have all these various stories about the people who left and never came back. And just to set the context, my husband had left the group, doing the work completely 2 years before this moment, and which had really given me the opportunity to be so fully immersed in the work. So I get that first email from the leader saying that he was leaving, and I was like, oh, that hurts, because it's a leader. But I, took a deep breath and I could say, like, okay, that's fine. I kind of went on in my day. I sent him a quick email saying, oh, so sorry, but I trust you. And I know this is going to be part of all the goodness, all the best for all of you. And then I went off into my day and did a bunch of other things. And then I get a call from one of my beloved, also a member of the executive committee. And she's like, Gerette, did you hear? And I'm like, yeah, it's so sad that he's left, what a bummer. And she's like, what, and there was like this silence. And she's like, you got to go back to your email, like there's more. They all left. And I'm like, what do you mean? And so I go back to my email and I see that all 6 of them have left on the same day, a mass exodus. So it was one email after another, and they all came in while I had gone off to do my laundry and was, blissfully being a mom and, enjoying myself. At that point, the world just turned completely upside down. And we were given the opportunity. We had the next day, this was like on a Tuesday, and the next day was our Wednesday weekly executive committee meeting. And so I was like, even though all 6 of them had left, we see this email that comes from Doug saying, it's okay, we're going to carry on, just kind of giving some reassurance. Go ahead and have the executive committee meeting, which he would always come to executive committee meeting, not at the beginning, but he would always show up at every single one at some point. This was the first time he did not show up. What I can now imagine is Doug was shitting bricks because everybody left and he didn't have a clue about what he could say to all of us. But we're in this meeting with the 6 leaders and about 12 or 15 other members of the executive committee. And the leaders are talking. And, to me, I had one question. I went into that meeting with one question, which was, why the mass exodus? Why are you leaving all together? And that question was in all that they were saying. We were, it's a 2-hour meeting. I never heard the answer. Like, I just couldn't. It was like, nobody's saying it. Nobody is saying, everybody's talking around. But nothing made sense to me until, Casey, it was literally 5 minutes before the end of the meeting. And one of the leaders, who is in some ways the most, I'd say, I felt the closest to in a way because of the gentleness of her spirit and who she is as a person. And she's someone who had gone through quite a bit of, abuse as a young person, and she's an artist. And when I heard that Kaylee just started speaking, and she said in these very real words, like simple terms, that Doug would call her again and again and berate her for hours at a time, and that had happened multiple times. And I'm listening to Kaylee's words, and while those words, like I know unequivocally that what she's saying is true. There was not a shadow of a doubt, and that what she's describing of Doug and his treatment of her was heinous and unacceptable. And in that moment, the pedestal that I had put Doug on collapsed. And I left that meeting and drove home. I had a long drive back to my home. And in that time, I didn't speak to anybody, as I left the meeting. And I took the long drive home. And in that 45-minute drive, a massive shift in my psyche took place. And this is something that is pretty unusual. This is why I call it snapping. It was so fast. it was like everything in my world turned right side up. I had been living upside down. It's like I had been living, and I suddenly could like see this. I was incredibly calm and very like I wasn't weeping. It was like my brain was rewiring itself. Like I still haven't met people who've had as fast a snapping as I have had, and I've met people who have had similar experiences, but like I was so oblivious until I was out, and it was a period like the next week there was some major revelation each day over the course of the next week. And, by the end of that week, I was, no longer a part of CTL. I was no longer a client of Doug's. I, had an understanding that what I had left was a cult. I mean, I have to say for myself, I feel extraordinarily grateful. Like, and what friends told me afterwards, like one of my good friends was like, Gerette, I thought you would be one of the ones who would never, ever leave. Because like she was one who had been doubting for a while and had, been part of, had been privy to some of the things that the 6 leaders were going through, some of their questioning. But I didn't have that. I didn't have that questioning at all. And I don't remember if I put this in my book or not, because I know I wrote about it, but she tells me that she was sitting across from me when Kaylee, this one of the 6 leaders, was speaking, and she said she saw it happening. She saw my face. She was watching, directly across me. She was watching my face, and she's like, "Holy shit!" Gerette gets it.
That is wild. Because when you initially went into that meeting, you went in really defensive of Doug with all of these questions, like, how could you do this to him after everything that he's given us?
For sure. I went in loaded, like, how could this be? Like, how could you do this? This betrayal, this ultimate betrayal. You've been family. We're family. Like, we've talked about each other as being family. How can you suddenly just up and leave in one day? It was just absolutely in the ultimate betrayal. There is the phenomenon called snapping when you go into a cult. And I had for, the whole time that I was in with Doug, there was that book, Snapping by Flo Conway, and I forget the other author's name, on my shelf. My husband had it. It was a school book. He had read a book that he had read in college, but I had never taken it off the shelf, but I sure did that week. But the phenomenon is mostly where people will go through a sudden personality change going into a controlling group. And that's what it's mostly used to describe. But my experience was really the snapping out.
And the fact that your friend said that she thought you would never leave, I feel that Doug was harshest and mistreated the people that he felt were the most loyal. Yourself and John, for example, as badly as he wanted to, and you would still defend him.
Yeah, and it's really that aspect of my experience that assures that what is the word? I don't even quite know how to say this, but that devotion, that loyalty that I had to him, and to the whole, to the whole school, to the whole, organization as a whole, that there are people who are by nature loyal. And those people, I think, in a controlling environment are very, very helpful people. And, you want to, a controlling leader wants to, keep you engaged in there as much as possible. And, I do now in my work with other people get to hear about so many experiences where they've tried to help a loved one get out, that have failed. And I can really identify with that, the person who's in, because I know that so well in myself. And that fierce, like you said, I went into that meeting, defending Doug, like what the hell are you doing here? So I know that on such a deep level.
Maybe it's the good-natured parts of people that are taken advantage of the most, or trusting parts, or maybe a bit of both.
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast today called The Commune. It's a group that were living intentionally at a place called Center Point. The leader got worse and worse. So a few parallels between your story today and this podcast that I've been listening to. The people who became involved with Center Point were everyday people, but also quite intelligent people. And there was somebody talking about how intelligent people are bigger risk takers because they have a softer landing, was how they said it. And I thought that was quite an interesting take, because of course, as we know, the perceptions around the air quotes type of person that joins a cult is not entirely reality.
Exactly. And yeah, those perceptions are, kind of, that it's losers or people who are, not in very vulnerable places, or they're, whatever, they're not to be trusted. Maybe they've been in really vulnerable situations before. There's all kinds of, stigma, but the truth is that the controlling groups really do, they know the benefit of smart people. And, and they know I think that cult leaders are extremely smart at identifying the traits and kind of getting a good mix of people and knowing what kinds of people should be attracted, like what's needed to kind of round out the community, even like, we really could use a lawyer,
Yeah, I mean, I always go back to Rancho Rajneesh when you use that as an example of, there was definitely a certain type of person that was sought after. Arm Shinrikyo, exactly the same, people of influence that could infiltrate the local communities and pull off all of these illegal acts that took place within these groups.
Because you don't think of it as illegal. When you've been indoctrinated, you truly believe that you're doing something for a higher purpose. And it's not like this is where I think in the legal system today, it's so essential that we develop a very clear understanding of what coercive control is. That because when we're compelled to do something that, against our morals, that whole, obviously the whole experience of moral injury is grave. It's a concept and a life experience that I think many of us can take years and years to grapple with, to make peace with, when we have done something that's in direct conflict with who we are. Who we are as a person. Like I remember going to my first ICSA conference, the International Cultic Studies Association. So my first conference, I, kind of palled up. This was obviously well before COVID. I palled up with someone and we went to lunch together and we're talking about the group that she was a part of. And she looked at me and, we were talking about indoctrination. And she said, if I had been asked to kill someone, I would have done it.
I wrote this in my notes because you had something similar to this in your book.
Right. And it's true. It's true. Like for me in that moment, hearing this, beautiful person who was part of a meditation cult say that to me was also like a wake up, like, okay, how far would I have gone? The group that she was a part of was more inclusive, more closed. It was a closed cult. It was a commune kind of cult. And you were, 24/7 involved in this. And I can imagine if I had been involved in a group like that, I too would have gone that far, could have gone that far. But because at least I did have, since I had a job and work, and my husband worked, and our kids went to school, and there were many ways that I had to still function in society.
Right.
I think that's probably was my saving grace, that it did not get that far for me. And yet for those that it does go that far, like that's where moral injury is so dramatic, it comes from when soldiers go off to war and end up, really violating the soldier's code. Like when you're a soldier, you have a code of ethics, like when I was in CTL, I lived by a code of ethics. And that code of ethics, becomes, just a very important part of one's identity. But when you behave in a way that's in contradiction, to your moral code, and it's like when your moral code is replaced by something that's toxic, when your internal moral code becomes the non-ethics of a controlling group, that's how it gets that bad, that you really could steal, kill, go that far because you believe it, that what you're doing is truly beneficial for the good of humanity. Like that's brainwashing or, indoctrination is.
It's almost like if leadership were to tell followers that we're not breaking the law because we dictate what the law is, then people sometimes might not even feel like they're actually doing anything wrong in terms of actually breaking the law.
Absolutely. And it doesn't, it doesn't, that's that whole phrase, being above the law, like not only like you are, like when you're in this kind of controlled mindset, laws become irrelevant, like they are a kind of, yes, that's what the secular people do, in JW, it would be a worldly thing.
Us worldly people, yeah.
Yes, this terrible worldly people, and that's how you can justify knowing that sexual abuse is taking place, because it doesn't look like sexual abuse to you. Because in your mind you have a justification, you also keep blinders. I think one of the things that is maybe not as discussed as much in terms of indoctrination is how you're taught, you're trained to stay in your lane. And even though, like as I said earlier, I was oblivious to the fact that the teachers who were the top leaders in our organization were not getting paid. I was oblivious to the fact that there was discontent in any way with them because I stayed in my lane. I did the work that Doug asked me to do. And when I stepped outside of that, that was me being in my shit. That was my pathology being active and thinking that I had something important to contribute. And what I really needed to do was to focus on my inner work so that I could really go through the final stages of becoming a woman of God.
And that sounds to me like literally breaking you down so that the last parts of you, your authentic self, don't exist anymore, so that you can be as malleable as Doug needs you to be. It's just such a vast topic, and it's so complicated, and there's so many different elements to it.
To truly understand undue influence and coercive control on a systematic and systemic level, that the more understanding that we can bring to these terms and how and how these systems manifest themselves in our, controlling groups of all kinds, whether it's business or, religious or spiritual or, just whatever, self-help, the whole gamut. But it's the dynamics themselves and recognizing that it is a system. It's not just a technique, it's actually a system. And if we can have a better understanding of that system, I believe, and actually I believe that the work that you're doing with this podcast, as well as this, this incredible surge of education and opportunities that's happening within the cultiverse, as we call it today, I think that is really starting to happen.
Yep. You're absolutely right. You're so right. A few individuals have asked why the episodes that I do are so long. First of all, I shouldn't call them interviews. I should call them conversations. And second of all, the reason the episodes are so long is because it's not just taking a glamorous, clickbaity headline. This abuse happened in this church. It's like, how did that abuse happen in the first place? And so you start at the beginning of somebody's journey. What was your childhood like? Were you born into the group? Experiences in the group, how you left, and what life has been like since. It's so important. And I don't want to say to somebody, your story is only worth an hour of my time. That's ridiculous. And we can't grasp how these groups work and exploit if we don't understand the entire system, as you said. So, hearing somebody's entire journey from one end to the other is so incredibly important to recognizing the symptoms and signs of cult-like behavior.
Where have I been? How did I get, what I often say is like, yeah, how did I get that lost for that long? And it's that question that has actually motivated me from, May of 2014, when I got out, to this day. Mm-hmm. And understanding that and holding space for people to find their way, yep. That's what actually brings extraordinary meaning to my life today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such valuable and great work. And Esther calls it a misadventure. That's my favorite phrase.
Yeah,
you don't want to call it a mistake, because I feel like that places blame on the individual. And of course, it's not the individual's fault in any way because of coercion. So misadventure is my favorite thing. So your 18-year misadventure. And then that leads us nicely onto where you are now, all of the activism work that you're involved in, and your plans for the future, and where people can find your book and all of your work, and all of the great stuff that has happened since your exodus.
Whew, since my exodus, my life began like in a new way. And I mean that sincerely. It was like I'm in the middle of my life for the first time, I think I had that experience somewhat as a child and in my early 20s. But to be in the center of my life again is just extraordinary. And, my work, it took me a little while to settle on really knowing that my work is really as an educator and not as a therapist. And so my passion is really for bringing understanding and education to the complex, nuanced systems that we experience in these worlds, the cultiverse. And I offer, I do individual consultations for people who need help with either a loved one who's part of a group or even groups. I've worked with groups. I've worked with, literally, a really interesting thing is to work with groups who are recognizing that there are aspects, kind of culty aspects of their organization. And they want to, in a sincere way, kind of reckon with it. And that's thrilling work for me. Let's see, and my work with writing has been just an extraordinary joy. And I had no idea. I'm an an insecure writer myself, and yet what I've discovered is that by creating opportunities for people involved, people who are survivors of cultic abuse, that they can come together and write, that is just a really beautiful, beautiful place to come and get support. But the supporting comes from your own reckoning, finding your own words to express your story. So the Writing to Reckon, there are weekly classes. There's also plans to do something that's a little bit more like for people who want more independence, that don't necessarily want to come to a weekly class. So that will be hopefully it might not be until October that I can start offering that, but that's in the works. I also will be doing a Writing to Reckon for people who have lost a loved one to a group. So not just for survivors, but for people who are dealing, with their personal experiences. And that's a population that I feel a lot of tenderness towards. And we'll be creating this space starting in September. And of course, hashtag I Got Out. That is, work that just literally gets me up in the morning and inspires me. My collaboration with Lisa in creating igotout.org, the website, just for real clarity here, the website is what supports the hashtag movement. The hashtag belongs to everyone who has experienced any level of undue influence or coercive control or anything, culty or religious trauma. The hashtag belongs to everyone. And so by using the hashtag, it's already like happening, the extraordinary bridges that are being built between people. And, we're heading, we'll be having, our first ever live and in-person experiences, which so the first one is happening in Portland, Oregon, in the summer, July. And I know that this podcast won't be listened to until after that, but we're also already speaking about how we can, create. We're doing another one for sure. We've planted seeds for the next one to be in Toronto, Canada, actually.
Wow. Okay. So much great work to keep you busy. So many plans in the pipeline to build on the amazing work that you're already doing. Collaborations happening left, right, and center. And I recently met another podcast host called Sarah Ferris, who has many podcasts. One of them called Conning the Con, which is an incredible show. If anybody wants something a little bit different, but also in line with coercion, she has a podcast about her sister getting conned by a confidence man. We're going to be speaking to Sarah tomorrow, actually, but so many parallels between cult leaders and con men. Oh, so many.
Absolutely. Yes.
So she said,
good for her.
A rising tide floats all boats. So collaboration is the key to making all of this stuff happen. And the work that you're doing, Gerette, is just absolutely invaluable, not just to the participants who have told me that they've really benefited from your work, but also the education that you're providing on a bigger scale for people like me who don't have the lived experience but want to understand it as much as possible, and bring the stories in a sensitive way from individuals to a public forum. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing. igotout.org. I'll post the links to Gerette's website, the social media handles for I Got Out and the I Got Out website, because as you said, those stories are from people of all walks of life, of all different types of experiences, and just allowing that platform to show people that they're not alone, to be validated in their experiences and know that oh my goodness, I'm not the only person that's been through this, or to even just put words to their experiences. I know you must know how empowering it is for somebody to say, that's what was happening to me the entire time. There's actually words for those things.
There is, and that experience of being calmed. I love that link because it's it's if we can identify for ourselves how we have been hoodwinked, how we've been calmed, just the little ways that it happens. It's part of our human nature. It's actually part of how we're wired. And that's a whole nother conversation, to look at, how influence works in us. But it's natural. So if we can recognize that in ourselves, it makes all of us more human. And like your friend Sarah said, I love that image, that a rising tide floats all boats. And that's where we are today in the rising tide of the cultiverse. And I so appreciate the work that you do, Casey. Thank you.
I just want to say a massive thank you to you, Gerette, for your time today, for coming and chatting with me, for setting me straight on a few things, because that's so important for my education and the listeners to be like, no, Casey, you're wrong there. So I really do appreciate that as well. And just trusting me with your story, letting me read a copy of your book, An Everyday Cult. Everybody should go grab a copy and have a read, because you won't regret it.
Thank you, Casey. Can I add one more thing? And that is that I've always believed that, like, I was an educator and I'm a mother, and I've always believed that people who are not parents, who don't have children, are really important in the world today. They're really important to children. And because I've witnessed that again and again, there's something special that they bring. And in that same way, you, as someone who is not a cult survivor, has a really important voice in this world. And I am so, so grateful for it. The perspective that you bring is unique and is really important. So thank you.
I really appreciate you saying that, Gerette, and I do hear you on that. And I know that there are many people listening who are on this journey with me and are doing their own small bits of activism and educating themselves as we go through these conversations as well. Thank you, Gerette. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, I will. And you as well. You have a good night.
Thanks, Gerette. Take care. Bye.
Bye now.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault Podcast.